Welcome to this journey through one of Appalachia's most unsettling historical cases. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you are joining from today. This connection between us makes each story feel even more immediate. The year was 1914. The mountains of North Carolina stood like slumbering giants, draped in forests so thick that little sunlight ever touched the earth below. In that era, the Appalachians were a realm of profound solitude and quiet, where entire communities lived cut off from the wider world, separated by miles of muddy paths and deep ravines. Life there moved to the rhythm of the seasons, slow and predictable, until something deeply troubling shattered that peace. In Madison County, a rugged area near the Tennessee border, small villages of wooden homes were scattered across the valleys. These were places where everyone knew each other, where news traveled by word of mouth, and where secrets, when they existed, were guarded as closely as winter food stores. Families survived on subsistence farming, hunting, and small trades that barely covered their basic needs. Paved roads were non-existent. Telephones were absent from homes. Contact with the outside world relied on messengers on horseback and newspapers that arrived days old. It was within this isolated setting that Tobias Whitmore lived, a man whose presence in those mountains would become synonymous with dread. Tobias was not originally from North Carolina. According to incomplete records discovered much later in county archives, he had arrived in the region around 1911, coming from an unspecified location in Virginia. No one knew for certain what had brought him. Some said he was fleeing debt. Others whispered about problems with the law. But the truth was, Tobias was discreet, nearly invisible, and this worked in his favor. He settled in a remote cabin built in a clearing surrounded by ancient oaks and pines that groaned in the wind. The property was nearly 10 kilometers from the nearest village, a distance that, in those days, meant hours of walking along treacherous trails. Tobias rarely visited the village. When he did, he purchased only the bare essentials: flour, salt, kerosene. He spoke little. He made even less eye contact. People described him as tall and thin, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold silent storms. For the first few years, no one suspected anything. Tobias was just another mountain hermit, and there were many such men, those who preferred the company of trees to people, men who carried their own shadows. But in 1914, something shifted. That was when the disappearances started. The first was a young man named Henry Caldwell, only 17 years old. Henry was known for his skill with traps and his courage in exploring unfamiliar parts of the mountains. One day in March, he went out to check his trap lines and never came back. His family organized a search that lasted for weeks. Dozens of men combed the valleys, streams, and steep slopes. They found nothing. Henry had vanished like smoke. 2 months later, it was Sarah Mitchell's turn, a 32-year-old woman traveling alone to visit relatives in another village. Her journey should have taken 2 days. 5 days passed, then 10, then 20. Sarah never arrived. Her mule was found wandering near a creek, its saddle and belongings still in place, but there was no trace of her. These disappearances created an atmosphere of fear that settled over Madison County like a thick fog. People began locking their doors even during daylight. Parents forbade their children from wandering off. Solitary trips into the woods, once commonplace, became rare. And amidst this silent panic, the name of Tobias Whitmore began to be whispered. No one had any proof. No one had witnessed anything. But there was something about his reclusive way of life, hidden away in that distant cabin, that stirred suspicion. Some men from the village decided to investigate on their own. They knew it could take weeks for any official law enforcement to act, if they acted at all. In the mountains, justice was often a matter handled by one's own hands. And so, on a foggy September morning, a group of 6 men made their way up to Tobias's property. They did not know what they would find. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps just a strange man living a strange life. But what they discovered in that clearing would forever alter the history of that region and haunt generations to come. The 6 men who ascended to Tobias Whitmore's property that September morning carried more than rifles and lanterns. They carried the weight of suspicion, the fear of families who had lost loved ones, and a quiet resolve born from helplessness. Among them was James Caldwell, the father of Henry, the first young man to vanish. His face, marked by sleeplessness and grief, reflected the agony of a parent who cannot bury his child because there is no body to bury. The path to Tobias's cabin was narrow and carpeted with damp leaves that muffled their footsteps. The trees formed a dense canopy so thick that even at midday the light seemed dim. The air smelled of moss and wet soil. Occasionally, the silence was broken by the distant call of a crow or the snap of a twig under a boot. The closer they got to the clearing, the heavier the atmosphere became, as if the forest itself was warning them to turn back. When they finally arrived, the cabin stood before them like a scar upon the landscape. It was a crude structure of poorly fitted logs, with a sagging, rotten roof. No smoke rose from the chimney. There was no sign of movement. The property was unnervingly silent, and this stillness was unsettling. Even abandoned places usually hold some life birds, insects, small creatures. Here, there was nothing. It was as if nature itself avoided this spot. James Caldwell stepped forward and shouted Tobias's name. His voice echoed across the clearing and faded into the trees. There was no answer. He called again, louder, more forceful. The silence that followed was almost physically oppressive. The men exchanged tense looks. Something was wrong. They decided to split up. 3 would circle the property to check the surroundings, while the other 3, including James, would approach the cabin directly. Each step toward the front door felt heavier, as if the air were growing thicker. The porch wood creaked under their boots. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in a non-existent breeze. James pushed it open with the barrel of his rifle. It swung inward with a long, sharp groan, revealing the shadowy interior. The light from the doorway was not enough to illuminate everything, but it was sufficient to show this was no ordinary home. A wooden table stood in the center, littered with objects that gleamed faintly. Chains, knives of various sizes, and something that made James's heart stop, a scrap of blue fabric he recognized instantly. It was from the shirt Henry had worn the day he disappeared. James's voice shook as he called to the others. The 3 men entered the cabin, and a smell struck them that was unbearable. A sweet, putrid odor, mixed with a chemical sting that burned their nostrils. One man covered his face with a handkerchief, fighting nausea. It took them moments to adjust before they could look more closely. Beyond the table, makeshift shelves lined the walls, holding personal items arranged with an almost meticulous care. A woman's hat, a pair of broken eyeglasses, a silver chain with a cross pendant, and more clothing, much of it neatly folded and stacked. Each item told a story. Each had belonged to someone. It was then that a scream came from outside. One of the men who had circled the property. It was a sound of pure horror, the kind a man makes when he sees something his mind cannot accept. James and the others rushed out, crossing the clearing toward the back of the cabin. There, concealed by dense bushes and partly covered by an old tarp, was a small barn they had missed. Its door was secured with a heavy padlock, but the sideboards were loose enough to peer through. One man had looked inside and was now on his knees, vomiting. James approached, rifle still in hand, and strained to see through a crack. What he saw inside cannot be described in detail without violating all sense of decency and respect. But it can be said that the barn showed evidence of having been used for dark and unimaginable purposes. There were tools no honest farmer or hunter would require. There were signs that people had been held there against their will. And there were remains macabre discoveries that confirmed the men's worst fears. James Caldwell fell to his knees. His hands trembled so violently he dropped his rifle. Tears streamed down his face as he finally understood he would never see his son alive again. Henry had been there. Sarah Mitchell had been there. And likely others. Two people who had vanished and whose families still waited for news. But where was Tobias Whitmore? The cabin was empty. The barn was locked from the outside, meaning he was not inside. The men searched the entire property, calling to each other, checking every corner and shadow. Tobias was gone. The more they looked, the clearer it became he had not merely stepped out. He had fled. Perhaps days before, perhaps only hours, but he had known. Somehow, Tobias Whitmore had known they were coming. Word of the discovery on Tobias Whitmore's property spread through Madison County like wildfire. Within hours, dozens of people began climbing the trail toward the clearing, driven by horror, morbid curiosity, and a desperate hope to learn if their own missing loved ones were among the victims. The local sheriff, a man named William Hutchins, was notified and arrived at the property later that afternoon with 2 deputies and the county doctor, Dr. Edgar Price. What these lawmen found confirmed, and in some ways exceeded, the initial accounts. Dr. Price, a 53-year-old who had seen much in his decades of mountain medicine, had to step away several times during his preliminary examination. He would later describe the scene in his official report as the most disturbing thing he had ever witnessed. Yet even in his documents and the surviving county records, the descriptions remain vague, clothed in technical and clinical language that obscures more than it reveals. Sheriff Hutchins ordered the property sealed off immediately. No one else was permitted to enter without authorization. The families who had climbed the hill were gently but firmly sent back to their homes. Identifying the victims would take time, and it was not a process for relatives to witness. Some resisted. James Caldwell had to be practically carried away by 2 men, shouting that he had a right to know, to see, to bury his son. For the next 3 days, Dr. Price and a small team worked on the property, documenting every find. Personal items were cataloged one by one. Fragments of clothing were compared with descriptions provided by families. It was meticulous and devastating work. With each identified item, another family received the terrible confirmation that their loved one would never return. In total, 5 victims were confirmed: Henry Caldwell, 17, Sarah Mitchell, 32, a man named Thomas Brennan, 28, who had disappeared 2 years earlier while traveling through the area, a young woman in her 20s who was never identified, as her belongings matched no reported missing persons, and the partial remains of one more individual, also unidentified, whose age and even gender could not be determined with certainty. But these were only the confirmed victims. Sheriff Hutchins believed there could be more, many more. Tobias Whitmore had lived on that property for at least 4 years, maintaining near total seclusion. How many people might have passed through those mountains and never been seen again? How many solitary travelers? How many wanderers? How many strangers no one would have thought to look for? The hunt for Tobias began immediately. The sheriff sent telegrams to all neighboring counties describing the man and the crimes. Posters were hastily printed at a shop in Asheville and distributed across western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. A reward of $500 was offered for his capture, a fortune in those days, enough to buy a farm or support a family for years. Search parties formed spontaneously. Armed men scoured the mountains, following trails, checking abandoned cabins, questioning anyone who might have seen a stranger. But the Appalachians are vast, and for someone who knew them, hiding would not be difficult. There were caves, secluded valleys, forests so dense they felt like night even by day. Tobias had that advantage, and he used it. Weeks passed with no sign of him. Some believed he had died in the wilderness, a victim of cold, hunger, or accident. Others were sure he had crossed the mountains into another state, where he could start a new life under a different name. But there were also those who swore they had seen him. Reports came from various places, always vague, always inconclusive. A tall, thin man spotted near a river, a shadowy figure observing a village from a distance. Strange footprints found near a cabin. The fear Tobias Whitmore had planted in the region did not fade with his escape. Instead, it grew. Now he was not merely a dangerous man. He was a ghost, an invisible presence that could be anywhere, watching, waiting. Parents forbade their children from playing far from home. Women refused to travel alone. Even armed men avoided the trails at dusk. Life in Madison County changed. People locked their doors and windows religiously. Neighbors organized night patrols in the villages. The sound of a snapping twig in the woods was enough to make hearts pound. And at night, when families gathered around their fireplaces, conversation inevitably returned to the same questions. Where was Tobias Whitmore now? Was he still alive? Was he planning to return? Sheriff Hutchins was relentless. He devoted months to the investigation, trying to piece together Tobias's life before North Carolina. He sent inquiries to authorities in Virginia, Tennessee, and even further afield. It was during this process that he uncovered something that made everything even more disturbing. Tobias Whitmore was not a real name, or at least, it was not the only name the man had used. Records from Virginia suggested he might be the same individual known elsewhere as Thomas Wade. And before that, possibly as John Morrison in Kentucky, always a loner, always living in isolated areas, always leaving behind whispers and unsolved disappearances. If this were true, then Tobias was not just a killer. He was something far worse. He was a man who had perfected the art of disappearing and reappearing, of crafting new identities, of leaving a trail of terror wherever he went without ever being caught. If he had done it before, then he could certainly do it again. The winter of 1914 arrived early in the Appalachians that year. By November, the first snowfall had blanketed the North Carolina mountains in a layer of white, rendering trails impassable and further isolating communities already cut off from one another. For many, that harsh winter brought a paradoxical sense of relief. If Tobias Whitmore was still hiding somewhere in those mountains, the brutal cold would likely kill him, or so people desperately wanted to believe. But winter also introduced new fears, with roads blocked by snow and communication between villages nearly impossible. Each family was isolated on their own property, feeling vulnerable and alone. The nights were long and dark, lit only by dim lanterns and the occasional glow of moonlight reflecting off the snow. And on those nights, the wind howling through the pines seemed to carry whispers, sounds that might have been branches creaking under the weight of ice, or perhaps the approach of footsteps. It was during this winter that the first strange reports began to emerge. A family living near the French Broad River swore they saw someone prowling around their property at night. Footprints in the snow led to the kitchen window and then simply vanished, as if the person had disappeared into thin air. Another family, nearly 15 miles away, found their barn door open one morning, despite being certain they had locked it the night before. Nothing was stolen, but it was clear someone had been there. Sheriff Hutchins personally investigated each report, even when it meant riding for hours through the snow. He examined the footprints, measured the tracks, and questioned witnesses. But he always arrived at the same frustrating conclusion. It was impossible to be certain. Footprints in the snow could belong to anyone. Doors might have been improperly secured. The pervasive fear in the region led people to perceive threats, where there might have been only coincidence. But then, in January of 1915, something occurred that could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. An abandoned cabin located halfway between two villages was found to be occupied. Locals familiar with the shelter, which was occasionally used by hunters and travelers, noticed smoke rising from its chimney. This in itself was not unusual, but upon closer inspection, they discovered signs that someone had been living there for weeks. Supplies were piled in a corner, empty cans of preserved food, candles burned down to stubs, and, most disturbingly, marks scratched onto the walls with charcoal or a similar substance, forming patterns that made no sense to those who saw them. Some appeared to be tallies, lines grouped in fives, as if someone were counting days. Others were stranger symbols, abstract drawings, words written and then scratched out until they became illegible. The sheriff was summoned immediately. He brought 2 men with him, and they arrived at the cabin at dusk, just as the light was fading. The door stood open. Inside, the fire in the hearth had recently died out, the ashes still warm to the touch. Whoever had been there had left only a few hours earlier, perhaps less. Hutchkins ordered his men to check the surroundings, but fresh snow that had fallen during the day covered any useful tracks. They searched the cabin methodically. Among the supplies, the sheriff found something that made his blood run cold. A small, worn, and stained leather notebook, its yellowed pages filled with uneven handwriting. He opened the notebook right there in the dim light filtering through the window and began to read. The first few pages were relatively ordinary, containing notes about the weather, trails, and water sources. But as he progressed, the content grew increasingly disturbing. There were descriptions of people where they had been seen, their habits, their routines. It read like the diary of a predator studying its prey. While no full names were given, there were initials that matched, with eerie precision, those of individuals who had disappeared the previous year. Further into the notebook, the notes became less organized. Fragmented sentences, words repeated over and over, angry outbursts. On some pages, there seemed to be attempts at justification, confused thoughts about justice, about punishment, about a world that had been cruel and would now pay the price. The mind behind those words was clearly fractured, oscillating between calculated lucidity and something far darker. Sheriff Hutchkins carefully secured the notebook. It was evidence, perhaps the first real evidence they had obtained since Tobias's escape. But it was also something more, a window into the mind of a man who was not simply a common killer. He was someone who thought, who planned, who felt a twisted need to document his actions and thoughts. The discovery of the occupied cabin and the notebook changed the nature of the search. Now they knew Tobias was alive. They knew he had spent the winter hiding in those mountains, somehow surviving the brutal cold. And most importantly, they knew he was still nearby. The markings on the wall, the stored provisions, everything indicated he had no intention of leaving. Those mountains were his territory, and he was not about to abandon them. Hutchkins organized a search operation unlike any before. Instead of large, noisy groups sweeping the forest, he formed small teams of 2 or 3 men, all experienced hunters and trackers who could move silently along the trails. The strategy was simple. If Tobias was hiding in the mountains, he would eventually need to move, to forage for food, to seek shelter, and when he did, they would be watching. For weeks, these teams patrolled the region. They checked abandoned cabins, monitored little-used trails, and investigated any sign of human presence. Slowly and patiently, they began to piece together a map of Tobias's movements. He was following an irregular pattern, never staying more than a few nights in one place, always avoiding villages, yet never straying too far from the area he knew. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse playing out in the snow-capped mountains. As February arrived, bringing the first signs of a thaw, both the sheriff and his men knew that something had to give soon. The weather was changing. The trails would become more accessible, and when that happened, Tobias might attempt a real escape, leaving these mountains to disappear forever into some other corner of the country. March brought unstable weather that made the mountains even more treacherous. Days of intense sunshine that melted the snow were followed by nights of frost that turned trails into rivers of frozen mud. Nature seemed undecided between winter and spring, oscillating between the two with a violence that reflected the tension gripping Madison County. People remained on constant alert, torn between relief at winter's end and fear of what the changing season might bring. It was during this period that reports of sightings increased dramatically. A farmer swore he saw a man watching his property from atop a hill, still as a statue, who vanished when he called his children inside. A woman returning from visiting relatives reported feeling as if she were being followed for miles along a narrow trail, though she never saw anyone when she looked back. A hunter found the remains of a hastily extinguished campfire, still smoldering, with footprints leading deeper into the forest. Sheriff Hutchkins meticulously cataloged each report, marking the locations on a rudimentary map he had created. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The sightings formed an irregular circle around a specific area of the mountains, a particularly wild region known locally as Hollow Creek, a deep valley carved by a stream that ran swiftly between moss-covered rocks. It was a place few visited, for the slopes were steep and dangerous, and the forest was so dense that even during the day, light barely penetrated. Hutchkins knew the valley. He had hunted there in his youth and recalled several small caves in the rock formations surrounding the stream. They would be perfect hiding places for someone wishing to remain unseen. He decided it was time to act, but he needed to be careful. A poorly planned search would only alert Tobias and send him running again. This time, they could not afford to miss. On the night of March 23, 1915, the sheriff gathered his most trusted men at a small nearby church. There were 12 of them in total, including himself, men who had proven their courage and discretion during the months of searching. By lantern light, his low but firm voice echoing among the wooden benches, he explained his plan. They would surround Hollow Creek before dawn, positioning themselves at strategic points around the valley. Then, slowly, they would tighten the perimeter, forcing whoever was inside to reveal themselves. They set out before midnight, moving in absolute silence along trails they knew by heart. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see their way without the need for flashlights that might give them away. The night chill bit through their heavy clothing, each breath producing a small cloud of steam. There was no conversation, only the soft sound of boots on damp earth and the occasional rustle of leaves. By 4 a.m, everyone was in position. The sheriff had arranged his men in a wide perimeter around Hollow Creek. Now, it was a matter of waiting for sunrise before they could advance. The hours that followed were the longest the men had ever experienced. The cold intensified as the night reached its deepest point. Every noise in the forest, every shift of shadows, made hands grip rifle stocks tighter. As the first light of dawn began to brighten the eastern sky, Hutchkins gave the signal. Slowly and methodically, the men began moving toward the center of the valley. They descended the slopes carefully, mindful of each step, their eyes constantly scanning the trees and rocks ahead. The sound of the stream grew louder as they approached the valley floor, a constant murmur that masked other sounds. That was when one of the men spotted the cave. It was a narrow opening in the face of a vine-covered cliff, nearly invisible even in daylight, but there were telltale signs. The vines had been partially cut, creating a discreet path, and near the entrance, half hidden under leaves, was a pile of cut branches, the kind used for making fires. The man signaled to the others, and they approached with extreme caution. Hutchkins reached the cave entrance and stopped, taking a deep breath. This was the moment. He could feel in his bones that they had found the hiding place. He sensed a presence there, something alive watching from within the darkness. He drew his revolver and called out loudly, his voice echoing among the rocks. No one answered. Only silence and the sound of the stream. Hutchkins called again, louder this time, identifying himself as sheriff and ordering whoever was inside to come out with hands raised. Still, there was no response. The men around him took up positions, rifles trained on the dark cave entrance. The tension was palpable, each second dragging on like an eternity. It was then that something moved in the darkness, a dim shape, just a darker shadow against the blackness of the cave's interior. The men stiffened, fingers on their triggers. The shape moved again, this time closer to the entrance, and then, slowly, a figure emerged into the light. It was Tobias Whitmore. There was no doubt. Even after months of living like a cornered animal, even with his beard overgrown and his clothes in tatters, recognition was instant. He was gaunt to the point of appearing cadaverous, his sunken eyes shining with a feverish intensity. His hands were stained with dirt and dried blood, and in his right hand he held a long knife, its blade catching the dim morning light. For long seconds, no one moved. Tobias stood at the cave entrance, staring at the men surrounding him. His face showed no fear, no surprise, only a kind of weary resignation, as if he had always known this moment would come, and now simply accepted his fate. Sheriff Hutchkins stepped forward, keeping his revolver level. His voice was firm as he ordered Tobias to drop the knife. But Tobias did not move. He just continued to stare, his breath creating small clouds in the cold morning air. And then, surprising everyone, he spoke. His voice was hoarse, as if it had not been used in a long time. What he said in that moment would change everything. The words that came from Tobias Whitmore's mouth that freezing morning echoed through the valley with disturbing clarity. He did not deny anything. He did not try to run. He did not beg for mercy. Instead, in that broken, hoarse voice, he said simply, "You don't understand anything. None of you understand what needed to be done." Sheriff Hutchkins felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. There was something in the way Tobias spoke, a sheer, disturbing conviction that suggested a mind completely disconnected from the reality everyone else shared. He repeated his order, louder this time, demanding that Tobias drop the knife and surrender. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Tobias remained motionless. His eyes moved from man to man, studying each face with an intensity that made even the bravest look away. And then, slowly, almost casually, he dropped the knife to the ground. The sound of metal hitting stone cut through the silence like a gunshot. Two of the men quickly approached, grabbing Tobias by the arms and forcing him to the ground. He did not resist. He allowed himself to be restrained with a strange passivity, almost as if his body were present, but his mind had already departed. Handcuffs were placed on his thin wrists, so thin now that the metal rings seemed too large. As they lifted him, his legs nearly gave way, weakness evident after months of malnutrition and exposure. While some men secured Tobias, others entered the cave to investigate. What they found inside would later be described in official records only as additional evidence of criminal activity. The cave was small, but Tobias had turned the narrow space into a disturbing kind of home. There was a makeshift sleeping bag made of animal skins, food scraps, mostly small game hunted and cooked over a tiny fire, and more personal items hung on the stone walls like macabre trophies. But what caught their attention most was another notebook, similar to the one found in the abandoned cabin weeks earlier. It had been carefully stored inside a metal can, protected from moisture. One of the men brought it to the sheriff, who opened it with hands that trembled slightly. Not from the cold, but from a fearful anticipation of what he might find. The pages were filled with more notes, more fragmented thoughts. But there was something different about this notebook. The first entries were dated, marking the days since Tobias had fled his property. He had documented his journey through the mountains during the winter, describing the brutal cold, the constant hunger, the moments when he nearly gave up and surrendered to death by freezing. But always, something kept him going, a force he himself did not seem to fully understand. In the later pages, the entries became even more disturbing. Tobias wrote about voices he heard, instructions he received, a greater purpose he needed to fulfill. He mentioned names the sheriff did not recognize, places that perhaps existed only in his fragmented mind. And there were lists, long lists of characteristics, of types of people, as if he were categorizing humanity into a classification system that made sense only to him. The sheriff quickly closed the notebook, feeling nausea rise in his throat. This was not just evidence of past crimes. It was proof of a profoundly sick mind, capable of justifying the unjustifiable, of transforming horror into duty. And the question that now haunted Hutchkins was, how many other notebooks like this existed? How many other hiding places had Tobias maintained over the years, scattered across different states, each containing records of acts no one had ever discovered? The journey back was slow and tense. Tobias walked in the middle of the group, surrounded by armed men, stumbling occasionally on the muddy trail. He did not try to run. He said nothing more. He just kept moving with that same empty, distant expression, as if he were walking in a dream from which he could not wake. As they passed areas where they could be seen from afar, people began to appear, at first just a few, then dozens. News of the capture had spread with incredible speed, traveling from house to house through the mysterious communication network that exists within small, close-knit communities. When the group finally arrived at the main town of Madison County around noon, hundreds of people were already waiting for them. Men, women, and even children lined the main street in an absolute, heavy silence. This silence was different from that of the forest. It was charged with pent-up emotion, suppressed rage, and pain finally finding a focal point. Some women wept openly. Some men clenched their fists so tightly their knuckles turned white. And they all stared at Tobias with an intensity that felt like it could burn. They stared at the man who had stolen their children, their siblings, their spouses, the man who had turned their lives into endless nightmares. Sheriff Hutchkins felt the tension in the air like a physical presence. He knew what this crowd wanted. He understood what they were capable of doing. Justice in the mountains often did not wait for courts and juries. There was a sturdy tree in the center of the village, and more than once it had served darker purposes when official law seemed too distant or too slow. He quickened the pace, his men following suit, forming a human barrier around the prisoner. They arrived at the small police station, a wooden building with only 2 cells in the back. Tobias was shoved inside, and the door locked behind him with a metallic clang that seemed to echo throughout the room. Through the bars, he finally looked directly at the sheriff, and for the first time since his capture, something resembling an emotion crossed his face. It was not regret. It was not fear. It was something closer to curiosity, as if he were genuinely interested to see what would happen next. Hutchkins immediately posted guards at the station, 4 armed men, 2 in front and 2 in back, with strict orders not to let anyone in under any circumstances. The crowd outside had not dispersed. They remained there, some sitting on the ground, others leaning against walls, all simply waiting for something they themselves could not quite define. That night, Sheriff Hutchkins did not sleep. He sat in his chair, his revolver on the table before him, listening to the sounds of the village through the window. He could hear low voices outside, murmured conversations. He could feel the tension hanging over everything like a storm about to break. and he knew with a certainty that ached in his chest that the next few days would be crucial. The law must prevail. Tobias Whitmore must face a proper trial. But the thirst for justice or revenge within that wounded community was a powerful force that could easily spiral out of control. And inside the cell, Tobias lay awake as well, stretched out on the narrow cot, staring up at the wooden ceiling. His lips moved silently, as if he were conversing with someone only he could see or hear, and occasionally a strange smile would cross his face, sending a chill down the spines of the guards watching him, a chill no coat could warm. The dawn of the next day brought a dense fog that covered the village like a gray shroud. The air was heavy and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and smoke from fireplaces that had burned all night. When Sheriff Hutchkins finally emerged from the station to assess the situation, he found the crowd still there, now swollen by people who had traveled from neighboring villages during the night. Some families had set up makeshift camps, as if prepared to stay for as long as necessary. James Caldwell was among them. Henry's father had aged years in mere months, his face etched with deep lines of grief that had not been there before. When he saw the sheriff, he approached with determined strides, and others followed. Hutchkins could see in their eyes what they were thinking, what they wanted. But before anyone could speak, he raised his hand, and his voice cut through the morning air. He explained that the law would take its course, that messengers had already been sent to the state capital, requesting that a judge and prosecutor be assigned to the case, that Tobias Whitmore would face a proper trial, and that justice would be served within the bounds of the law. His voice was firm, but there was a weariness in it that everyone could hear. He was asking them to trust the system, to wait, to not turn their pain into something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Some in the crowd accepted his words reluctantly. Others remained unconvinced. One man shouted that the law had failed to protect his loved ones, so why should they trust it now? Others echoed similar sentiments. Tensions were beginning to rise again when something unexpected happened. An elderly woman, known to everyone as Grandma Martha, pushed her way through the crowd. She had lost a grandson 2 years earlier, a young man who had simply vanished while traveling in the area. Martha stood before the sheriff and spoke in a voice that, despite her age, carried authority. She said she understood the anger they all felt, that she shared it, but she reminded everyone that they were a Christian community, that their values and their faith separated them from those who commit monstrous acts. If they abandoned those values now, if they let the darkness consume them, then Tobias Whitmore would have won in a way that transcended any judgment or punishment. Her words created a different kind of silence, a thoughtful silence. People began to look at each other, to reflect. It was not an immediate or complete change, but it was enough to ease the pressure that had been threatening to explode. Gradually, some began to disperse, returning to their homes or camps. Others remained, but the atmosphere had subtly shifted from blazing anger to a somber yet controlled vigil. In the days that followed, the village's routine attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy, though everyone knew nothing would be normal again anytime soon. Sheriff Hutchkins conducted formal interrogations of Tobias, always accompanied by witnesses who documented every word, but extracting meaningful information from the prisoner proved nearly impossible. Tobias answered some questions with short, enigmatic sentences. Other times, he remained completely silent for hours, staring at a spot on the wall, as if he could see through it. When he finally spoke about the crimes, it was in a cold and distant manner, as if he were describing events that had happened to someone else. He showed no remorse. He offered no explanations that made any sense within the normal logic of human behavior. During one interrogation, Hutchkins asked him directly why he had done it. Why those specific people? What had they done to deserve such a fate? Tobias looked at him with those deep-set eyes, and responded with a line that would be quoted in newspapers and whispered in conversations for decades. They were chosen, not by me. I was just the instrument. Can't you see the threads that connect it all? The sheriff could extract nothing more that day. Tobias returned to his impenetrable silence, leaving Hutchkins with more questions than answers. It was clear they were dealing with someone whose mind operated in patterns that defied comprehension. There was something deeply broken there, something that perhaps had always been broken, waiting only for the right circumstances to fully manifest. Meanwhile, the investigation of Tobias's original property continued. Teams of men excavated the ground around the cabin and barn, searching for more evidence, for more victims, and they found them. Each day brought new, grim discoveries that needed to be cataloged and, when possible, identified. The number of confirmed victims rose from 5 to 7, then to 9, and there were still areas that had not been fully explored. The magnitude of Tobias Whitmore's crimes began to reveal itself with ever greater clarity and horror. It was not just the murders themselves, though those were horrific enough. It was the duration, the persistence, the meticulous way he had operated. It was the fact that he had lived among them for years, walking the same trails, perhaps even greeting people on the rare occasions he visited the village, all while harboring secrets so dark they defied imagination. Letters began arriving from other regions. Sheriffs from neighboring counties, even from other states, wrote describing unsolved cases dating back years' disappearances that had never been explained, with characteristics that matched Tobias's methods. Sheriff Hutchkins organized these letters into piles, trying to trace Tobias's possible trajectory through the years, and the more he investigated, the more frightening the picture that emerged became. If the connections beginning to form were correct, Tobias had not begun his crimes in North Carolina. There was a trail of potential victims stretching back at least a decade across multiple states. He had moved from place to place, always choosing isolated areas, always maintaining his solitary hermit pattern, always leaving behind broken families and mysteries that would never be fully solved. The arrival of the state-appointed judge and prosecutor was announced a week after the capture. They would arrive within 2 days, bringing with them the legal framework necessary to conduct a proper trial. The news brought relief to some and frustration to others. The process would be long. There would be procedures, appeals, all the complexities of a legal system that seemed overly complicated for a case where guilt appeared so obvious. The night before the state officials arrived, Sheriff Hutchkins paid his final visit to Tobias before the case was completely out of his hands. He sat outside the cell, watching the prisoner silently for long minutes. Finally, he asked the only question that truly mattered, the question that kept everyone awake at night. Were there more victims who would never be found? More families who would never know what happened to their loved ones? Tobias turned slowly to look at him. A small, unsettling smile curved his lips, and then, in that husky voice that sent chills down anyone's spine, he said, "The mountains hold many secrets, Sheriff, more than you could ever imagine, more than anyone will ever find." And with those words, he turned back to the wall, ending the conversation. Sheriff Hutchkins left the station that night with a new weight on his heart. Tobias Whitmore's capture had brought some measure of justice, but also the terrible confirmation that the full extent of his crimes would likely never be known. There were ghosts in the North Carolina mountains now, and there always would be. The 2 men who arrived by carriage on the morning of April 5th, 1915, brought with them not only the authority of the state of North Carolina, but also the promise that there would finally be a formal reckoning with Tobias Whitmore. The judge was a man in his 60s named Harold Pianton, known for his sternness and impartiality. The prosecutor, Arthur Blackwell, was 43 and had a reputation for never having lost a homicide case. Both men had traveled for 3 days from Raleigh, traversing poor roads and braving rains that turned the path to mud. Sheriff Hutchkins greeted them personally, first escorting them to a small hotel where they could settle in and rest from their journey. But less than an hour had passed when Judge Pianton requested to see the prisoner and review all the evidence collected. His urgency was understandable. The state's newspapers had covered the case extensively, and public pressure for swift and definitive justice was immense. But Pianton also understood that speed could not compromise the integrity of the legal process. For the next 2 days, the judge and prosecutor worked tirelessly. They reviewed every document, every piece of evidence, every testimony collected. They visited Tobias's property, walking the very places where unimaginable horrors had occurred. Blackwell, despite his experience with brutal cases, had to pause frequently during the inspection. Even for someone trained to deal with the worst manifestations of human nature, this place was particularly disturbing. The prosecutor conducted his own cross-examination of Tobias, attempting a different approach than the sheriff had used. He was methodical, almost clinical in his questions, seeking to establish a clear timeline of events. But Tobias maintained his pattern of fragmented answers and long periods of silence. When he spoke, his words remained enigmatic, full of references that made no sense and justifications that existed only in his own distorted reality. It was decided that the trial would begin within a week. This would give enough time to notify witnesses, prepare the prosecution, and ensure all legal procedures were followed correctly. Judge Pianton made it clear that despite the horrific nature of the crimes and the public outcry, Tobias would receive a fair trial. He would be assigned a defense attorney, given the right to present his version of events, and all legal safeguards would be respected. Some in the community received this news with outrage, feeling that a monster like Tobias did not deserve such consideration. But the judge was adamant. The choice of defense attorney was problematic. No local attorney was willing to take on the case. Community hostility was so intense that anyone representing Tobias would be seen as a traitor, as defending the indefensible. Eventually, it was necessary to bring in an outsider, a young Asheville lawyer named Robert Chen, the son of immigrants who had recently graduated and had not yet established deep roots in any particular community. Chen arrived 4 days before the trial, a lean 28-year-old with intelligent but nervous eyes. He knew that taking this case could destroy his career before it had even truly begun. But he also believed deeply in the principle that every accused person deserved adequate representation, no matter how gruesome their alleged crimes. It was an idealism that would be tested to its limits in the coming weeks. The first meetings between Chen and Tobias were difficult. The lawyer tried to establish some kind of defense strategy, but Tobias seemed completely disinterested in the proceedings. When Chen asked about his version of events, Tobias responded vaguely or simply remained silent. When the lawyer tried to explain the legal implications and potential sentences, Tobias looked right through him, as if seeing something far beyond the cell walls. Chen began to suspect something others had already considered. Tobias Whitmore was not sane. There was a fundamental disconnect between his perception of reality and the reality shared by everyone else. The lawyer requested an evaluation by a doctor specializing in mental illness, and Dr. Price, who had conducted the initial examination of the evidence at the property, was called in to evaluate the prisoner. The examination lasted 3 hours. Dr. Price asked questions, observed behaviors, and attempted to map Tobias's thought processes. What he found was disturbing in its complexity. Tobias clearly understood the difference between right and wrong in abstract terms. He could articulate moral concepts when prompted, but there was a profound dissociation when it came to applying these concepts to his own actions. It was as if he lived in 2 realities simultaneously, one where he understood social and legal norms, and another where he operated under a completely different set of rules that existed only in his own mind. Dr. Price's report was cautious, but clear. Tobias displayed signs of severe mental disturbance, possibly some form of persistent delusion combined with traits we would now recognize as characteristics of severe personality disorders. However, determining whether he was legally insane at the time of the crimes was a more complex question. He had demonstrated planning, premeditation, and even efforts to conceal his actions. These were not the behaviors of someone completely divorced from reality. The debate over Tobias's sanity dominated conversations in the village in the days leading up to the trial. Some argued that anyone capable of such acts was by definition insane. Others insisted that insanity was no excuse, that he knew exactly what he was doing and should pay the ultimate price. Opinions were intense and divided, reflecting issues that transcended that specific case and touched on profound philosophical debates about human nature, responsibility, and justice. Meanwhile, practical preparations for the trial moved forward. The village's largest church was designated as a temporary courthouse, the only space large enough to accommodate all those involved and the many observers who would surely attend. Pews were rearranged, a table was set up for the judge, and spaces were demarcated for the prosecution and defense. The transformation of a place of worship into a court of justice seemed somehow appropriate. Both dealt with questions of good and evil, guilt and redemption, though through different lenses. The night before the trial began, the village was unusually quiet. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what was to come. Families gathered in their homes, talking in hushed tones about what they would witness, about how they would finally hear details that had been kept secret until then. Some prayed, seeking strength to face the revelations to come. Others simply sat in silence, lost in their own reflections. Sheriff Hutchkins did not sleep that night. He sat in his chair at the station, listening to the night sounds through the open window. He could hear the wind in the trees, the distant barking of a dog, the occasional rustle of someone passing by on the street. And from the back of the station, where Tobias lay in his cell, there was no sound, a silence so profound it was almost as if the prisoner had ceased to exist, evaporated into the darkness. But Tobias was there, lying on his cot, his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. His lips moved silently, forming words no one would ever hear, and in his mind, thoughts circulated in patterns that made sense only to him, preparing for the spectacle that would begin with the light of the next dawn. The morning of April 13th, 1915, dawned clear and cold, with a pristine blue sky that seemed cruelly indifferent to the dark events about to unfold. Even before sunrise, people began to gather around the church that would serve as the courthouse. They came from all directions. Some had walked all night from distant villages. Others had camped nearby. Everyone wanted to be there. Everyone needed to see with their own eyes the man who had haunted their lives and the trial that would finally bring him to justice. At 8 in the morning, Judge Pianton ordered the doors opened. The crowd entered in a surprisingly orderly fashion, filling every available pew until there was no room even to stand. Those who could not get in remained outside, standing at the open windows or simply waiting for news that would inevitably trickle out from within. The atmosphere was dense, charged with an anticipation that bordered on unbearable. Tobias was brought from the police station under heavy guard. 4 armed men escorted him, forming a protective circle as they walked down the main street. He wore the same clothes he had worn the day of his capture, now laundered but still visibly worn. His hands were handcuffed in front of him, and a chain connected the handcuffs to shackles on his ankles, forcing him to walk with short, shuffling steps. When the crowd saw him, a murmur ran through them like a wave, but no one moved, no one shouted. They just watched in silence as he passed. Inside the transformed church, Tobias was positioned next to his attorney, Robert Chen, The young lawyer looked pale and tense, his hands nervously organizing and rearranging papers. Across the table, Prosecutor Arthur Blackwell sat with an expression of firm determination, surrounded by stacks of documents and carefully catalogued evidence. And above them all, at a raised table where the lectern would normally be, Judge Peonton took his place, his wooden gavel resting before him as a symbol of authority and order. The trial began with formal proceedings. The judge explained the charges against Tobias Whitmore, a seemingly endless list. 9 counts of murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, additional charges related to the handling of the victim's remains. Each charge was read loudly and clearly, and after each, Tobias was asked to state his position, guilty or not guilty. To the surprise of many, Chen had advised his client to plead not guilty, not because he denied the facts, but because he planned to argue mental incapacity, claiming that Tobias could not be held criminally responsible due to his disturbed mental state. It was a risky strategy that infuriated many present, but it was the only viable defense available. Tobias, following his lawyer's instructions, muttered, "Not guilty," after each charge, his voice so low it could barely be heard beyond the first row of benches. Prosecutor Blackwell began presenting his evidence methodically and devastatingly. He called witness after witness, each contributing a piece to the macabre puzzle. Sheriff Hutchkins testified about the initial discovery on the property, his voice trembling slightly as he described what had been found. Dr. Price explained his findings during the examination of the evidence in medical yet disturbing terms. Family members of the victims identified personal items that had belonged to their loved ones, some breaking down in tears upon recognizing a hat, a chain, or a piece of fabric. James Caldwell was called to identify the blue shirt that had belonged to Henry. When the fabric was placed before him, his hands trembled as he touched it. He confirmed it was his son's, pointing to a patch his wife had sewn on a few months before Henry's disappearance. His voice broke as he spoke, and he had to stop several times to compose himself. When he finally stepped down from the witness stand, he looked directly at Tobias, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it seemed physical. Tobias did not return his gaze, keeping his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if none of it had any connection to him. Throughout the first day of testimony, Tobias remained nearly motionless. Occasionally, his head would tilt slightly, or his lips would move silently. But he showed no emotional reaction to what was being said. It was like observing a statue, something that had human form, but was devoid of everything that makes a person human. This indifference was perhaps even more disturbing than any show of remorse or defiance would have been. On the second day, the prosecutor presented the notebooks that had been found. Passages were read aloud, revealing the twisted thoughts Tobias had recorded. Each entry was more disturbing than the last, revealing a mind that had constructed elaborate justifications for unjustifiable acts. Some in the courtroom covered their faces with their hands, unable to hear any further. Others forced themselves to listen to every word, feeling they owed it to the victims to fully understand the extent of the horror that had occurred in their own community. Blackwell also brought in experts who had examined the property. An agricultural engineer spoke of modifications Tobias had made to the barn, alterations that served sinister purposes. A tool expert identified instruments found on the property and explained their gruesome uses. Each testimony added another layer of horror, building a case so solid and comprehensive that it seemed impossible to doubt Tobias's guilt. It was not until the third day that the defense got its chance. Robert Chen called Dr. Price again, this time focusing on his examination of Tobias's mental condition. The doctor testified about his observations, the prisoner's disjointed responses, and his clear dissociation from reality. He explained that, in his professional opinion, Tobias suffered from severe mental disorders that affected his ability to distinguish between right and wrong as sane people can. But under cross-examination by the prosecutor, Dr. Price had to admit that Tobias also demonstrated clear signs of planning and premeditation, that he had taken steps to conceal his crimes, and that he had fled when he realized he would be discovered. All of these actions suggested an understanding of the consequences of his actions, an understanding that what he did was wrong in the eyes of the law and society. Chen then did something unexpected. He called Tobias to testify in his own defense. A murmur of surprise ran through the courtroom. Allowing the accused to speak was risky, especially someone as unpredictably disturbed as Tobias. But Chen clearly hoped that simply letting the jury see and hear Tobias would be enough to prove his insanity. Tobias was led to the witness stand. He sat down slowly, his chains jingling, and for the first time during the trial, his eyes moved deliberately around the room, taking in the faces watching him. Chen began with simple questions: name, age, where he was born. Tobias answered quietly but clearly. Then Chen asked about his arrival in North Carolina, about his life in the mountains. Tobias responded, but his answers began to wander, including extraneous details that made no sense, tangents that led nowhere. When Chen asked about the crimes, Tobias was silent for long minutes. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath, waiting, and then he began to speak. But what came out of his mouth was neither confession nor denial. It was a rambling discourse about higher purposes, about standards that needed to be maintained, about voices that guided and instructed. He spoke as if he were describing necessary work, an unpleasant but essential task someone had to perform. The words flowing from Tobias Whitmore filled the courtroom with a different kind of horror than the physical evidence had provoked. It was the horror of looking directly into a broken mind, of hearing justifications that existed in a parallel reality where the unimaginable became not only acceptable, but necessary. He spoke of signs he saw in people, invisible marks only he could perceive, characteristics that identified them as those who needed to be removed from the world. His voice maintained a monotone, as if he were reciting a recipe or reading technical instructions. Prosecutor Blackwell allowed Tobias to continue for some time, realizing that every word he said only strengthened the prosecution's case. But when it was his turn to cross-examine, he was direct and relentless. He asked if Tobias understood that taking another person's life was wrong. Tobias hesitated, then replied that yes, in a general sense, people should not kill others. Blackwell then asked if he had taken steps to conceal his actions. Tobias admitted that he had. He kept his property secluded and avoided visitors. When Blackwell asked why he would hide his actions if he did not know they were wrong, Tobias remained silent. His eyes flickered repeatedly, as if processing a contradiction his mind could not resolve. Finally, he muttered something about people not understanding, about how they would see everything wrong because they could not see the patterns he saw. It was a response that simultaneously suggested a sense of guilt and a complete disconnect from shared moral reality. The interrogation continued for hours. Blackwell was meticulous, carefully constructing a portrait of someone who, despite his clear mental disturbances, still possessed enough understanding of the nature of his actions to be considered criminally responsible. When it finally ended, and Tobias was led back to his seat, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Everyone had heard something they would never forget, words that would haunt them for years to come. Closing arguments began on the fourth day of the trial. Chen did his best, arguing passionately that his client was a sick man who needed confinement in a mental institution, not execution. He pointed to the clear evidence of delusion, to the way Tobias lived in a constructed reality that did not correspond to objective reality. He implored the jury to consider that punishing someone who could not truly understand the moral nature of his actions was not justice, but merely revenge. Blackwell responded with equal passion, but from a completely different direction. He acknowledged that Tobias was disturbed, possibly even insane by certain medical standards, but he argued that this did not absolve him of responsibility. He had chosen vulnerable victims. He had planned meticulously. He had hidden evidence. He had fled when discovered. All of these actions demonstrated not only an understanding that his actions were wrong, but also cunning and deliberation. And most importantly, 9 people were dead. 9 families destroyed. 9 lives taken by someone now trying to use his own monstrosity as a shield against consequences. The prosecutor walked slowly before the jury as he concluded his argument. His voice was firm, but charged with restrained emotion. He spoke about each victim by name, reminding the jury that they were not judging abstract crimes, but the destruction of real lives, real people who had dreams, families, futures that were stolen from them. He spoke of Henry Caldwell, just 17 years old, whose life was just beginning. Of Sarah Mitchell, traveling to visit family, trusting in the basic goodness of humanity. Of Thomas Brennan and the others, each with their own story, each ending up in the same horrible place. By the time Blackwell finished, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom. Even Judge Pianton had to pause and clear his throat before giving his final instructions to the jury. He carefully explained the legal standards they should apply, the definitions of sanity and insanity under the law, and the required levels of proof. His voice was professional and measured, but even he could not completely hide the emotional weight of the moment. The jury retired to deliberate shortly after noon. The crowd that had filled the church during the 4-day trial remained. No one wanted to leave, everyone needing to be present when the verdict was announced. Hours dragged by. The sun crossed the sky and began its descent toward the horizon. Whispered conversations filled the room, speculation about how long the deliberation would take, about what each additional minute might mean. It was nearly 6 in the evening when the deliberation room door opened. The jury was ready. Utter silence fell over the courtroom as the 12 men resumed their seats. The jury foreman, a 48-year-old farmer named Samuel Brooks, held a piece of paper in his slightly trembling hands. Judge Pianton asked if they had reached a verdict. Brooks replied that they had. Tobias was instructed to stand. He did so slowly, his chains clanking in the absolute silence. His face showed no fear, no anticipation, no sign of anything. It was as if he were completely oblivious to the fact that the next few seconds would determine his fate. Judge Pianton asked the foreman for the verdict on the first count, the murder of Henry Caldwell. The word guilty came from Brooks's mouth clearly, echoing off the church walls, and then it came again. Guilty, and again, guilty. For each of the 9 murder charges, for each additional charge, the answer was the same. Guilty. 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 The words hammered like blows, each carrying the weight of justice finally being served. When the final verdict was read, something happened that no one had anticipated. A sound began quietly, just a few muffled sobs, but then grew louder. Weeping, not of sadness, but of relief. Of a release of months of tension and fear and pent-up pain. People who had remained strong throughout the trial finally allowed their emotions to emerge. They hugged each other, cried on each other's shoulders, letting years of anguish finally find expression. Judge Pianton banged his gavel, calling for order, but his voice was gentle. He allowed the emotions to calm naturally before continuing. The sentence would be handed down the following morning, allowing time to prepare the appropriate documents and allowing everyone a night to process what had just happened. Tobias was led back to the police station through streets that were now filled with people. This time, there were sounds, not shouts of rage or threats, but something more complex. Some were crying. Some simply stared in silence, and some, surprisingly, whispered prayers. Not for Tobias, but for the victims, for the families, for the very community that had been so deeply wounded. That night, the village experienced something strange. Despite the gravity of the day, despite everything that had been revealed and relived, there was a sense that a chapter was finally closing. People knew the wounds would take years to heal, if they ever healed completely. They knew the memories of what Tobias Whitmore had done would stay with them forever. But they also knew that he had been stopped, that he would no longer claim victims, that justice, imperfect as it always is, had prevailed. And inside his cell, Tobias sat on his cot, staring into the darkness. If he understood what had happened, if he understood that his life was essentially over, his face revealed nothing. His lips moved silently as they always did, conversing with presences only he could perceive, still living in that parallel reality he had constructed for himself, one that no verdict, no sentence could penetrate. The morning of April 14th, 1915, dawned gray and damp, with heavy clouds hanging over the mountains like a grim omen. The crowd that gathered again around the church-turned-courthouse was smaller than in previous days, but still substantial. Those in attendance were primarily the victims' families and prominent members of the community. The sentencing moment did not bring the same frenetic need for presence that the trial had. The verdict had already been handed down. All that remained was to simply formalize what everyone already knew would be Tobias Whitmore's fate. Judge Pianton arrived early, his grave expression revealing the weight of responsibility he carried. Even in cases where guilt was indisputable and the sentence virtually predetermined by the laws of the time, issuing a death sentence was never a task undertaken lightly. He had spent the night reviewing legal precedents, ensuring that every procedure was followed to perfection, not because he had any doubts about the justice of the verdict, but because he wanted to ensure that no technicality could later be used to question the legitimacy of the proceedings. Tobias was brought in at precisely 9 o'clock. If the night in his cell had brought any reflection or change in his mental state, nothing in his appearance suggested it. He walked with the same shuffling steps, his face maintaining the same blank expression that had characterized his presence throughout the trial. As he stood before the judge, his eyes wandered the space, never lingering on anything for more than a few seconds. Judge Pianton began with legal formalities, reiterating the verdicts that had been handed down the previous day. His voice echoed through the silent church, each word heavy with meaning. He then asked if the accused had anything to say before the sentence was pronounced. It was a standard question, part of legal protocol, but everyone in the courtroom leaned forward, curious to see if Tobias would finally say something that made sense, something that offered explanation or remorse or any recognizable human emotion. Tobias was silent for long minutes. Then, surprisingly, he began to speak, but what emerged was neither a plea for mercy nor an expression of regret. Instead, it was another of his rambling speeches about patterns and purposes, about how he had been merely an instrument, about how everything was part of something larger that none of them could comprehend. His voice was monotonous, almost hypnotic in its strangeness. Some in the courtroom looked away, unable to continue looking at him. Others remained fixed, morbidly fascinated by the window those words offered into a mind so fundamentally broken. Judge Pianton finally interrupted him gently, but firmly. He had heard enough. It was time to pronounce sentence. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Pianton opened the formal document he had prepared. His voice was steady, but there was a solemnity in it that transcended the professional and touched the deeply personal. He spoke about the nature of the crimes, about the destruction of innocent lives, about society's need to protect itself from individuals who posed such extreme danger. And then came the sentencing. For each of the 9 murder convictions, Tobias Whitmore would be sentenced to death. The executions would be carried out by hanging, as stipulated by North Carolina law, The date would be set within 60 days, allowing time for any legal appeals the defense wished to file, though everyone in the courtroom knew such appeals would be merely formalities in a case so clearly resolved. When the judge's gavel fell for the final time, marking the official end of the proceedings, a collective breath seemed to be released. Tobias did not visibly react to the sentence. He continued to stare into space, as if the announcement of his death held no more meaning to him than any other trivial piece of information. He was taken back to the police station under the same heavy guard, and this time the streets were emptier, the crowd's morbid curiosity finally satisfied. The days that followed brought a strange sense of anticlimax. After weeks of intense tension, after the drama of the trial and the catharsis of the verdict, life needed to somehow return to some semblance of normalcy. People returned to their routines, to their work in the fields, to their daily lives. But everything had changed in subtle and not so subtle ways. There was a new weariness, a distrust that had not existed before. The innocence of a community that believed it knew all its members had been irrevocably lost. Attorney Robert Chen filed the expected appeals, more out of professional duty than any real hope of success. He argued technicalities, questioned procedures, but his heart was clearly not in it. Even he, who had defended Tobias out of principle and legal obligation, seemed relieved that his task was essentially complete. The appeals were quickly denied by the higher courts. The case was too strong, the evidence too abundant, the guilt too unquestionable. The execution date was set for the 14th day of June 1915. It was a Monday morning, deliberately chosen to be discreet, without pomp or circumstance that might turn the event into a spectacle. The gallows was erected in the back of the police station, away from public view. Unlike previous times when executions were public events drawing crowds, this one would be witnessed only by the necessary officials, legal representatives, and a select few witnesses. James Caldwell was one of the chosen witnesses. He had requested to be present, feeling he owed it to his son to see the end of the story with his own eyes. When the day arrived, he dressed in his best clothes, as if he were going to church. His wife had offered to accompany him, but he graciously declined. Some things, he felt, a man must face alone. In the weeks leading up to the execution, there were a few visitors to Tobias's cell. A local pastor came regularly, trying to offer spiritual comfort, seeking some sign of repentance or acceptance of guilt that might bring peace to the condemned man's soul. But his conversations with Tobias were frustrating and fruitless. Tobias occasionally responded to his attempts at spiritual engagement, but always with that same disconnect from reality, speaking of religious concepts in ways that distorted them into something unrecognizable. Sheriff Hutchkins also spent time with Tobias, not out of compassion exactly, but out of a sense of duty. He had been responsible for capturing this man, for bringing him to justice. Now he would be responsible for overseeing his end. There was something deeply personal about this entire journey, and Hutchkins felt the need to understand as much as possible who Tobias Whitmore was beyond the monster his actions revealed. During one of these final conversations, just 3 days before the scheduled date, Hutchkins asked Tobias if he had any regrets. It was a question he had asked before, but this time, knowing the end was near, perhaps there would be a different answer. Tobias looked at him with those sunken eyes and said something Hutchkins would never forget. Regret implies choice. I only did what was always meant to happen. The patterns demanded it. I responded. It was, the sheriff realized, the most honest and revealing thing Tobias had ever said. It was not a confession or an apology. It was simply the truth of how Tobias saw his own existence, as someone with no real agency, driven by forces only he could perceive. It was terrifying and sad at the same time, the realization that this broken mind genuinely did not operate within the same moral parameters the rest of humanity took for granted. the night before the execution fell over Madison County with an unnatural stillness. It was as if even nature itself was holding its breath, awaiting the dawn that would bring the definitive end to Tobias Whitmore's story. At the police station, the prisoner lay on his cot, his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling as they had been on so many other nights. But this time there was a subtle difference. His lips no longer moved in hushed conversations. There were no more whispers to unseen presences, just silence. A silence so profound that the guards watching him felt a chill run down their spines. Sheriff Hutchkins could not sleep that night. He sat in his office, an open bottle of whiskey on the desk, though he had barely touched it. He thought about the months that had passed since that September morning, when desperate men climbed into a secluded clearing and discovered horrors none of them had ever imagined possible. He thought about the families destroyed, about the victims whose names he now knew as intimately as those of his own relatives. And he thought about Tobias, about that human enigma that would never be fully understood. Dawn arrived slowly, tinging the sky with pinks and golds that seemed cruelly beautiful given what was to come. At 5 a.m, Tobias was awakened and offered his last meal. He ate only a little bread and drank water, refusing everything else with a silent shake of his head. He was then led away to wash and change into clean clothes that had been provided. Throughout this process, he maintained that same blank expression, moving mechanically as if his body were present, but his mind had already departed elsewhere. At 6 o'clock, designated witnesses began arriving. James Caldwell was among the first, his face a mask of suppressed emotion. Also present were Judge Pianton, Prosecutor Blackwell, Dr. Price, and a few other official representatives. They gathered in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, each processing what they were about to witness differently. The gallows had been constructed simply but efficiently, a raised wooden platform, a rope hanging from a solid beam, a trap door that would open with the pull of a lever. There was nothing elaborate or ceremonial about the structure. It was merely functional, a tool to carry out the sentence the law had decreed. At 6:30, Tobias was brought from inside the police station. His hands were tied in front of him, but his feet were free to walk. The local pastor stood beside him, whispering prayers that Tobias seemed unable to hear. When he saw the gallows, there was a momentary pause in his steps, the first and only sign of hesitation he showed. But then he kept walking, climbing the wooden steps with a slowness that seemed endless. At the top of the platform, the executioner, a man brought from another county specifically for this task, waited. He positioned Tobias over the trap door, adjusting the rope around his neck with professional precision. The pastor made a final attempt to offer spiritual comfort, asking if Tobias wished to make any final statements, any confessions, or any pleas for forgiveness. For long seconds, Tobias remained silent. Then, in a voice that was surprisingly clear and firm, he spoke his last words. What he said is still debated by those few who were present and heard. Some reported that he said, "The patterns finally complete themselves." Others swore he said, "Now I will see what was always hidden," and some insisted he spoke no coherent words, only an unintelligible murmur that was lost in the morning wind. Whatever the exact truth of his last words, they were followed by silence. The black hood was drawn over his head, hiding his face from view for the last time. Sheriff Hutchkins, fulfilling his final duty in this case that had consumed so many months of his life, gave the signal. The lever was pulled. The trap door opened with a sound that echoed through the surroundings like thunder, and Tobias Whitmore fell through the opening, the rope tightening with sudden force. It was quick. Dr. Price, who was timing the process, would later certify that death had been instantaneous, the neck broken by the fall. There had been no prolonged suffering, no struggle, just an abrupt end. The witnesses remained in absolute silence for several minutes. James Caldwell stared at the swaying body, tears streaming silently down his face. They were not tears of sadness for Tobias, but a release of years of pain and anguish. A closure he had desperately needed, but now discovered was emptier than he had expected. Seeing the man who had killed his son die had not brought Henry back. It had not undone the pain. It merely marked a final point in a story that should never have been written. The body was left hanging for the legally prescribed time, then lowered and placed in a simple pine coffin. Tobias Whitmore would be buried in an unmarked area on the edge of the local cemetery, with no headstone, no ceremony, no marker for future generations to find. It was as if the community wanted to erase even the physical memory of his existence. His personal belongings, including the disturbing notebooks he had kept, were burned that same afternoon, their ashes scattered to the winds. In the days and weeks following the execution, life in Madison County gradually began to return to something resembling normal. Families who had lost loved ones began the long process of trying to rebuild their lives around the permanent voids that remained. James Caldwell eventually managed to visit the site, where he believed Henry's remains had been buried, planting a sapling there that would grow strong and tall, a living memory of a young man whose life had been cut short too soon. But even as life went on, the shadows lingered. The stories of Tobias Whitmore and his crimes became part of local folklore, told in hushed voices through long nights, used to frighten wayward children and remind travelers to be cautious. The cabin where he had lived was burned to the ground, and the clearing was eventually reclaimed by the forest, as if nature were trying to heal the wound that had been opened there. Sheriff Hutchkins remained in his position for another 20 years. But those who knew him well said something in him changed after the Whitmore case. He became quieter, more reflective, carrying with him a knowledge of the depths of human capacity for evil that weighed heavily on his soul. He never spoke publicly about the case, but in private moments with those close to him, he occasionally shared his reflections on those terrible months and the lessons they taught about fragility, vigilance, and the eternal need for communities to protect themselves and each other. The questions Tobias Whitmore raised have never been fully answered. How many victims were there? Where had he been before arriving in North Carolina? And how many other places held similar secrets buried within their lands? These questions remained unanswered, haunting investigators and historians who would later attempt to reconstruct his trail through the ages. The Appalachians are vast and keep their secrets well guarded, and some mysteries are simply never fully solved. Today, more than a century after those dark events of 1914 and 1915, few know Tobias Whitmore's story outside of academic circles studying historical crimes. The clearing where his cabin stood is indistinguishable from any other part of the forest. There are no markers, no plaques, nothing to indicate that something terrible once happened there. But the mountains remember, the stories persist, and we remember those victims whose lives were taken, whose families were destroyed, whose names deserve to be known. Not for the horrific details of their deaths, but for the entirety of their lives. If this dark story resonated with you, if these words brought to light a forgotten chapter of history that deserves to be remembered, please like this video. Do you want to continue this journey through history's most disturbing and mysterious cases? Then subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss any of the stories yet to come. And in the comments, tell me what other historical mysteries you would like to see explored. Your participation keeps these stories alive, ensuring that the victims are never forgotten and that the lessons are learned. Until the next journey through the shadows of history,